Today, we're digging into a really challenging perspective, one that comes directly from our source material. It's about the role of women in the conflict in Gaza. We're going to deconstruct the argument that what we're often shown is an incomplete picture, and that some women are not just victims, but active participants raised in an ideology of conflict.
And that brings us to the central question our source material wants us to grapple with. In any war, who is a victim and who is a combatant? It sounds simple, but the source argues that the lines get incredibly blurry, especially when you look past the headlines. All right, so here's our game plan for unpacking this. First, we'll tackle the main idea, what the source calls the indoctrination thesis. Then, we'll dive into specific case files it uses as proof. From there, we'll look at the legal side of things, the battle over media narratives, and finish with the source's warnings about what happens when prisoners are released.
Okay, let's jump right into Section 1, the indoctrination thesis. This is really the core of the entire argument. So the source claims that this isn't about random acts, but something systemic. It argues that from a very young age, a specific ideology is drilled into kids in schools, preached in mosques, and reinforced right in their own homes. The text even traces the roots of this ideology back to figures like Amin al-Husseini, a known Nazi collaborator, suggesting this creates a foundation for conflict that is generations deep.
So that's the theory. But to support a claim that big, you need evidence, right? Well, the source moves from these broad claims to some very specific case files. Let's take a look at the people it holds up as examples. First up, the case of Muna. The text states that when she was just 19, she used an online chat room to lure a 16-year-old boy, Ophir Rahum, into an ambush where he was murdered. She was sentenced to life in prison, but was eventually released in a prisoner swap. And here's the detail the source really hones in on. Upon her release, she was publicly welcomed by leaders like Mahmoud Abbas and Ismail Haniyeh. Next, the source presents Alam al-Tamimi. She was involved in the 2001 Sparrow Pizzeria bombing. According to the text, her role was to scout for a target that would be packed with people and then drive the suicide bomber there. The attack ultimately killed 15 people, including 7 children. She was handed 16 life sentences, but just like Muna, she was later released. And to really hammer home its point about ideology, the source includes this quote, which it attributes to al-Tamimi after her release. She apparently hosts a TV show now, and the source highlights this quote to argue that for some, there is absolutely no regret, just an unwavering commitment to the cause. And the list in the source goes on. It details several other cases, accusing women of everything from driving bombers and smuggling explosives to actively recruiting and training other women for suicide missions. The key point here is that the source presents these not as isolated incidents, but as evidence of a much wider pattern.
You know, hearing these stories raises a pretty big question. How does international law even begin to categorize these kinds of actions? This is where the source shifts from individual stories to the legal definitions that are supposed to govern armed conflict.
And the key term it brings up is unlawful combatant. This isn't just a phrase, it's a specific legal category. It refers to someone who's directly involved in the fighting, but does it without wearing a uniform or carrying their weapon openly. Essentially, by blending in with civilians, they're breaking a fundamental rule of war.
And that distinction has massive consequences. According to the source's interpretation of the Geneva Conventions, once you act as an unlawful combatant, you give up the protections you would normally get as a prisoner of war. This legal framework is absolutely central to understanding the context for how these individuals are handled when they're captured. So if that's the legal situation, how is all of this presented to the rest of us? Well, the source is extremely critical of the narrative it says is being pushed by some media outlets and NGOs. This slide really gets to the heart of that critique. The source contrasts what it calls the common media portrayal, where women and children are shown only as victims, with its own argument that this narrative completely ignores their potential role as active perpetrators. It also claims that casualty numbers are often reported without telling you where those numbers are actually coming from. And to back that claim up, the source cites data from an organization called 50 Global. It alleges that a staggering 98% of the casualty figures used by many media outlets come directly from Hamas-affiliated sources. This really raises a fundamental question about transparency and why it's so important to know the origin of the data we're seeing. This leads us straight to the final part of this explainer. What happens after these individuals are released? The source raises some very serious alarms about the long-term consequences of prisoner exchanges. 82%. That's the number. According to Shabak data that the source cites, that's the percentage of prisoners released in the Gilad Shalit deal who went right back to terrorist activities. The text presents this as a truly shocking rate of recidivism.
And to put a face on that statistic, the source points directly to Yahya Sinwar. He was released in that same prisoner exchange. He then rose through the ranks to become a leader in Hamas and is identified as one of the main architects of the October 7th attacks. His story is used to argue that these releases aren't just a diplomatic issue. They can have devastating consequences down the road.
And the source wraps up with this pretty dire warning. It argues that when the full, complex picture isn't reported, including the indoctrination and the actions of all participants, it contributes to what it calls a moral catastrophe in our post-truth world. And so, after all that, we're left with this incredibly difficult question. After looking at the case files, the legal definitions, and the media criticism laid out in the source material, we're forced to confront a really complex problem. If a system is designed from the ground up to turn people into combatants, where does responsibility for the violence that follows truly lie? The source definitely suggests there are no easy answers.